right, friends. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to set you up that this morning's going to be a little different. I'll explain more, but just dropping that out there from the beginning. But we'll start. I'll share a story. This Wednesday, I attended another vigil in San Francisco at a place I'm becoming very familiar with attending vigils at. I even got arrested at a vigil at the beginning of December there. But this vigil at 630 Sansom Street was different than many of the others I have attended. It was being held in honor of the Japanese Day of Remembrance. I have just a few images from this action. The Japanese Day of Remembrance is a day that lifts up the significance of February 19th, 1942, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which led to the forced detention for over 4 years of more than 120,000 Japanese Americans. While this gathering is an annual event to remember that grievous event in our nation's history, this year was different than some of the other memorial experiences because it was intentionally held in front of the ICE headquarters of Northern California. So here, survivors and their descendants were not just telling the stories of their own trauma and the harm that impacted them. You see this guy has I was prisoner number 33824. It's a picture of him as a small child. I believe he was the one who was actually born in detention, who spoke. Never again, as his sign says. So here the survivors and their descendants were not just telling the stories of their own trauma and harm that impacted them. They were connecting the trauma and harm, their trauma, to the trauma and harm that is impacting immigrant families today due to the harsh policies enacted by our current administration. So one 92-year-old survivor of Japanese internment forcefully made the case, saying something along the lines of, too often, we Asian Americans have been called a model minority. But this identity has been built on the backs of Black and brown people who are really the same as us. So we need to stand with our neighbors because we're all the same. All people want to be able to live here and make a life and be with their families. All people deserve freedom. This event was an experience of what I would call embodied solidarity. One racial group of another generation holding in their bodies the trauma of the experience they lived, and allowing that traumatic memory not to close them down, but to open them up to other racial groups of a different generation. They are responding today to the capturing and detaining of immigrants in a unique way because they remember what it was like to be captured and detained. Watching this embodiment of solidarity was a really powerful reminder that our histories may shape us in difficult ways. But sometimes that shaping can also open up unique possibilities for connection, care, even healing. Well, I start with this story because it reminds me a bit of a story we're going to be looking at today from the New Testament. Now, today is the second Sunday of Lent, and this year we're working for Lent with some materials that come from the folks at A Sanctified Art. And the title of the series this year is Tell Me Something Good. In a world full of plenty of bad news right now, probably many of us are reeling from more bad news that came in this weekend, right? It's a discipline to make space to attend to the good news of the gospel and consider how that good news might actually impact even that which is hard that we're living through. So, as I alluded to a bit ago, today's teaching is going to be a bit different than my typical Sunday sermon because I'll be real, y'all, I've had a week. It's been a full week. I'm not going to be speaking to what that has been, but I will tell you my preparation has been a bit in flux. So, I thought this could be a fun opportunity to make a more collaborative experience than sometimes my Sunday sermons are. So it's not quite a sermon and it's not quite a Bible study. It's something in the middle, experimental, and we'll see how it feels. We'll make meaning together. So rather than me just teaching for half an hour or so and then everyone chatting in groups for about 10 minutes, I'm going to be sharing some stories, some nuggets of information, some things I've learned about our text. And then I'm going to invite you guys to break into small groups multiple times interwoven throughout our time together and kind of make meaning of some of these things together. And then in the end, we'll kind of, as a bigger group, perhaps make some meaning of what we want to take away from it. Sound good? We'll try it. See how it feels. If nothing else, it'll be interesting. So before we get into the text for today, we're going to try that. We're just going to do a soft launch of these conversation groups, okay? I'm going to invite you to chat with a few folks around you, building off of the story I just told you about Japanese Day of Remembrance. And so in groups of about 4 people or so, let's just take a few minutes, not long, but if you have something to connect with, feel free to share it. Have you had a moment, this is the first question, when you noticed that you responded differently to an event than others around you because of something unique in your own background? Does that make sense? So that's going to be our starter question. I know that could go super deep. We're not going to go super deep on it. But if you have something that comes to mind, feel free to share. So let's grab, and I would say whatever small groups we huddle in, we're going to be returning to them regularly. So just keep that in mind. Okay? So I'm sending you off for 3 or 4 minutes to chat about that and find a group that you want to be chatting with throughout our gathering today. All right. I'll invite us to come back, finish your comment, and we'll have more chances to chat with this group, I promise. All right, so today's story, which is chosen by the folks from A Sanctified Art, if you're following the devotional, you'll see resources on this story this week. This is honestly one of my favorite stories. It's a great story. It's found in the Gospel of Luke, and similar to the story we actually looked at a couple weeks ago as we were setting up Lent. It takes place at a dinner party in the home of a Pharisee that was attended by Jesus. And I know you're like, wait, didn't we just do that? Yes, this comes from earlier in the narrative because in Luke there are 3 dinner parties that Jesus attends in the homes of Pharisees. Okay, so we looked before at the 3rd one. Now we're going back in time, or back in the narrative at least, and looking at the 1st one. Okay, so this is Luke 7, and we're starting out with verse 36. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house, and he reclined at the table. And a woman in that town, who lived a sinful life, learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, and so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And then she wiped them with her hair and kissed them and poured perfume on them. And when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If that man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of a woman she is, that she is a sinner." Jesus answered him, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. And then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, which would have been the custom. But she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss. Again, generally customary when greeting somebody. It's just a little kiss on the cheek. That was culturally appropriate. But this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. And the other guests began to say among themselves, well, who is this who even forgives sins? And Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So that's our story. Jesus is dining in the home of Simon the Pharisee. The group is eating seated. Now, folks in this time, the way that they actually ate apparently was to actually recline around a table. It seems awkward to me, but they were propped up on cushions, laying towards the table with their feet facing away from the table. Okay? And then at Jesus's feet, this woman appears, who clearly is not on Simon's guest list. And before we seek to draw some meaning from the story, and particularly what good things it might communicate to us, I'm now going to move into just sharing, a few interesting pieces of cultural history and interpretive history that might help us bring some extra meaning out of the story today, okay? And I'll be inviting you to discuss the learnings along the way, okay? So the first thing I'm going to note about this passage, something I wouldn't have necessarily noticed on first reading it myself, is the intentionality that the author Luke uses of the literary device of an internal monologue. Okay? According to this passage, Simon is reacting to the presence of the woman by speaking to whom? To himself, right? And that there's this aside happening, right? Simon's inner thoughts are being revealed in the story. And that concept of an inner monologue does not probably seem very unusual to us. It's something we've probably encountered in literature, in theater, in film, and yet we may not know that it would have been very unusual to a first century audience to hear inner thoughts revealed in a story. It just wasn't a common device at that time. In her commentary on this passage, New Testament professor McCall Beth Dinkler points out that in the ancient world, most writers did not use the device of sharing a character's inner thoughts. When something occasionally like this was communicated, it was generally reserved for a character that was considered the hero of a story. And so there would be this moment of crisis where the hero has to make a decision about what to do about the crisis. And that is the moment you would see some inner deliberation, how the hero is assessing the situation and what choice they're going to make about it. But Luke seems to be using this device in a different way. He is not giving us the hero of the story's thoughts. We never hear the thoughts of Jesus in the book of Luke. But we do hear the thoughts of Simon the Pharisee. As Dinkler points out, Luke tends to use internal monologue for characters who are not noble or heroic. In fact, they often embody self-centeredness. Kind of interesting, right? And so that brings me to my question for us to consider together. What might the author of this story, who we know as Luke, be trying to highlight about Simon, about the woman, and about Jesus by describing Simon's private thoughts? Why would an author choose to use a novel technique to speak about this? Why is he showing us Simon's inner thoughts? What's he trying to tell us about Simon, the woman, and Jesus? So discuss for 4 minutes, and then we'll come back and share to the bigger group maybe some of our core insights. Yeah. Yeah. So we feel comfortable with the question? Can we bring back the part of the text that shows us again? When this is the relevant verse. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw the woman pouring the perfume, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of a woman she is, that she is a sinner. And then Jesus responds, hey, Simon, I have something to tell you. That's also worth keeping in mind, right? Because Simon does not say this to Jesus, but Jesus seems to pick up on it, right? All right, so that's our question. Why? What is Luke trying to highlight about Simon, the woman, and Jesus by describing Simon's private thought that way? Okay, giving you 4 minutes, and then we'll share back for a bit. All right, friends, I'm bringing us back. Whew. What did we notice? Sorry, we noticed I spilled some water. Maybe appropriate, right? So who has something they might, that they noticed that we could just share with the larger group if you're open to sharing? Yeah. That his inner thoughts were kind of like, he was not even present to the fact that he hadn't really given a lot of the common pieces of hospitality. Oh, thank you. But instead, is caught up in his thoughts about the judgments about the woman, right? Yeah, that's interesting. Other thoughts? Yes, 100%. So assuming that she's a sex worker, we'll say, I think that's the assumption, at least that's being implied, that people seem to be holding her accountable instead of the people who are taking advantage of her services. Yeah, so sorry. And the comment was, Lynn came from Lynn, and that idea of that people are offended by the woman, often in this context, as opposed to the men, potentially, who are her clientele, if she is a sex worker. The woman is the one seen as the sinner. Yeah. And yes, thank you, Ginny. Simon was being a judgy bitch. That was really what we see. Right. He should know. Right. He should know the context in which she exists, right? All right. Any other comments we want to bring into the space? 100%. Thank you. That's brilliant. Yes, that Simon... What? Repeat what she said. Yeah, I will. That Simon's thoughts are a stand-in, potentially, a proxy for the audience's thoughts, right? That Simon represents, potentially, what other people who are reading this story might be thinking. Smart use of internal monologue by our author there, we can acknowledge. Okay, so let's move on. The next bit of information I'm going to invite us to consider is the parable itself, okay? So Jesus responds to being able to read what actually is happening in Simon, whether it was like prophetically downloaded or whether he's just super intuitive. He responds with a parable. Now, in seminary, one of my favorite New Testament professors was a guy named Klein Snodgrass, and he's also the guy that's kind of known in the nerdy New Testament world as having written the tome on the parables. And I still go to it every single time I study a parable because the stuff is good. And his book is called Stories with Intent, if you are curious. And in that book, Dr. Snodgrass breaks the parables of Jesus into different categories. And the parable that we're looking at is what he would call, and this is a nerdy word, but I'll just explain it. He calls it a juridical parable, okay? A juridical parable is a story that he says is intended to wound from behind. What that means is you see the parable set up a scenario that invites the reader, the audience, to make a judgment that would seem rather obvious and correct. But when they make it, they inadvertently make a critical judgment about themselves. Does that make sense? That's the wounding from behind. So in this case, the story is of the two debtors who are released from their debts. I'll just clarify that in the language, in the Greek that we're working with, the word that is translated in our translation, forgiveness, can also be translated release. It's the same word. So for forgiven debts, released from debts. And this is a story that likely many folks would have related to in Jesus's audience, because most of the people Jesus is hanging out with, are not particularly wealthy. They're working class, economically depressed, and indebtedness was a major part of why folks had a hard time in the ancient world. Debt was a real problem. And so in Jesus' story, one of the debtors was forgiven 500 denarii, Jesus says. Now, in that time, the average working class person made about a denarii a day. So that tells you we're talking 500 days worth of work, a year and a half worth of work, versus about 50 days worth of work, a month and a half or so, right? And that's the story that's being told, and the story invites Simon to draw the obvious conclusion. The person who is released from more debt is likely to be more loving and grateful. But when Simon makes that conclusion, he ends up lifting up the woman as an exemplar and critiquing himself. The story has that surprising impact in the way it, quote, wounds from behind. We get it? So this brings me to our next conversation. Have you ever found yourself wounded from behind in some way by a story? Could be literary, musical, theatrical, film, visual. Something that revealed something to you about yourself that maybe was a little uncomfortable through the way the story was told. Make sense? Think about it. See if you have any examples. And what impact did that ultimately have? If you have. And if it's not you, have you seen that happen in somebody else you know? Some situation you can connect with. Does that make sense? 4 minutes, and then we'll share back a few other ideas. All right. Anything that came to mind that you guys want to share back? We'll invite you back. Yeah. Okay, a good one from Luca. Connie's.
Connie was sharing that a while ago. An NPR affiliate tweeted the text from the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. And I guess a bunch of right-wing people saw this and started freaking out and calling it out for left-wing, like super liberal crap before they realized that it was just the Declaration of Independence text.
Some of those people get mad hearing the Beatitudes as well as that woke lefty shit. Right? All right. Other examples. Do we have another example or two? Otherwise, we don't necessarily have to. We can move forward. But if there's something else anyone wants to share. Interesting to think about, right? All right. I'm moving forward. So the last piece of cultural information I stumbled upon while studying this passage is the spiciest, I'll say, I have for us. So fair warning. But in my study of the passage, I found the thesis of this woman, Lily Reed, who'd done an immense amount of work considering what Lynn was speaking to about sex work in the ancient world, and specifically the bathhouse in the ancient world, which I think turns out to be, probably pretty relevant to our story. So the story does not explicitly call the woman in question a sex worker, but the implications are there. That this is the kind of sin that she seems to have a reputation for, at least in Simon's mind. He's clearly scandalized, not only by her presence, but by the intimacy with which she's touching Jesus. But I think our understandings of her actions might be enriched to know a little bit about the culture that she likely arose from, if she was, as he suspects. So before I go further, I just want to name a content warning real quick that we can't speak about sex work in the ancient world without speaking about sexual violence and exploitation. So that's the content warning. If you have a history with sexual violence and exploitation, take care in whatever way you need to as we discuss this. Who are sex workers in the ancient world? From what we can tell, most of them were enslaved people whose bodies were being exploited by their masters and trafficked to other people. They generally did not receive income, or very much of it, for the work that they were doing because they were being used, they were being objectified on behalf of others. These women, and sometimes men, there were a few who were not actually enslaved, but were just generally heavily indebted, as I spoke of before, debt being a real issue, economically impoverished, very little agency to their economic status. So even more pertinent for our passage, Miss Reed discovered through a lot of research the culture. It's important to understand the culture of what's called the Roman bathhouse. There were these large communal bathing spaces that existed throughout the Roman Empire, including one has been discovered in Galilee, where this story took place. And people of all classes generally went to these large public bathhouses, including most Jewish people were a part of the bathhouse culture. And the baths were generally staffed by mostly enslaved people working them. And one of the tasks that some of the enslaved women were required to perform was massage. And so these massages were not always explicitly sex work, but because these women were really, it was like to be a slave is already pretty close to the bottom of the tier. To be a slave in a bathhouse who is a woman is like the very bottom of the social tier. So these women, even if they were not trained necessarily, their task wasn't supposed to be sex work, because they are so vulnerable, inevitably, they were vulnerable to exploitation. Inevitably, sexual activity was demanded of them, whether they were there to do it or not. And so enslaved women working in the bathhouse would have been well-versed in techniques of massage. Generally, these were done with olive oil. Most people who came to the bathhouse got a massage afterwards with olive oil. But very, very wealthy clients would occasionally be massaged with perfume that they would pay highly for. There is, in fact, documentation of wealthy patrons gifting their favorite body workers bottles of perfume, and it was understood to be a way of like inviting them, securing them for an ongoing relationship, a patronage relationship in which they would receive body work and sexual favors. I think this context brings us potentially some helpful insight into this woman, who she may have been, and how her interaction with Jesus may have been personal to her own lived experience, but also perhaps a subversive reclaiming of agency for her. What do I mean? Well, according to Luke, the woman came to Simon's house uninvited and of her own accord. Research says traveling alone as such a woman at night, a woman of such low status, would have just made her vulnerable to be out on the street by herself, to exploitation and violence, just right there. So she took a huge risk coming to this guy's house at night. But she took it because she wanted to demonstrate care to Jesus. If, as Lily Reed convincingly argues, that we are to understand her as a bathhouse worker, she seems to have used the skills that she has acquired and her knowledge of the body to bring care and comfort to Jesus. It was not a proposition, clearly. It was an act of care and devotion. She was using her hands willfully, skillfully, on behalf of expressing her own love and care, rather than in submission to the will of someone else. Further, she likely reclaimed the perfume that had been given to her to be used on those who would sexually exploit her, and she gave it to Jesus, who she believed to actually be worthy of this precious ointment that was very rare in her time. So, hearing all that, I'm going to give us a few questions actually to consider. This will be our last conversation time, and then we'll just try to make meaning of the whole thing together. But I'll give you a few of them. How does your understanding of the culture this woman emerged from impact your understanding of her? Why do you think she responded to Jesus the way she did? As we named before, the term translated forgiven here can also mean released. So what do you think this woman experienced release from? And what might Simon the Pharisee need release from? We'll take a little longer, maybe 8 minutes or so, 10 minutes, to just chat about those, and then we'll kind of be moving into wrapping it up, okay? So whichever feel the most, you don't have to talk through all three, whatever feels like it's interesting and resonant to you. All right. We're going to try to pull this back and make some meaning and move into worship. Sounds good. Where does it all go? Let's just take a moment to hear some of the insights that maybe were coming out in your groups, if anyone has something they want to share. Did you guys have fruitful conversation? Yes. Anything anyone wants to share? You don't have to, but.
Okay. This is based on what Lorraine said, because I hadn't thought about that. Like, how does Simon know who this woman is and what she does unless he's had a relation? How does he know? Maybe he knows about her from the bathhouse or something like that. And how does she know where he lives? You know what I mean? How does she know how to get to this private dinner party? So it's like, do they have a relationship? And the part where Jesus talks about, who feels more grateful for being forgiven, the person with more sin or the person with less sin? It's really the person who repents of their sin, which Simon never does. Let's say that he did engage in the sin of exploiting this woman. He doesn't repent. He blames her, essentially, for being a sinner. And so, I don't know. I just thought that kind of came out in the story.
Yeah, maybe the release isn't necessarily so much about her sinfulness, but more a release from the captivity of her agency being completely subsumed. Yeah. I think we were kind of exploring some of those questions too about, I don't know that we landed anything conclusively, but there's a sense of like everyone actually needing some sort of release here. But maybe hers was not the same as what Simon needs, which is maybe more actually about sinfulness. And the caste system, a release from her status as the bottom of the caste. If nothing else, I don't know that Jesus could give her a different job, right? But at least he's clearly inviting her to understand herself as something different, right? Yes, in a way that's like beautifully redemptive, right? All right, so we've had a chance to learn together about how Luke uses interior monologue, how Jesus uses parable, what cultural information can tell us about the woman. I just want to remind us at the end of this story, we see that Jesus lifts up this woman as a model of great love. The term he uses for her love is not an erotic term. In Greek, they had multiple words you could use for love, but he is speaking of agape love, the selfless kind of love of neighbor that he has been calling his followers into when he told them the greatest commandment is to love God and love your neighbors. He uses that love as the way of describing the great love she is demonstrating. So, processing all this information together as we move to finally wrap it up today. As we consider this story, the framing of our series is tell me something good. What something good does this story tell us? Give us maybe a few thoughts. Yeah, Dia. Transformation is possible. Yes. May it be. The worth is not the same as what you do. Amen. 100%. Jesus is not on the side of the patriarchy or empire. That is something good, right? Caste systems are human. That is not how the divine sees us. Amen. I heard something. Go for it. Go for it. Yes. Our shame can become a source of power. You took the words out of my mouth. I had written something like, our trauma can be transformed into medicine that heals rather than hurts. Right? Our shame can become a source of power. I think this is the heart of resurrection, right? That the things that hurt us can also become transformed into something that can heal and bring connection. It is what we talked about at the beginning, right? Yes. Using your resources wisely and subversively is a valuable thing to do. And I would add, it reminds us we all have the capacity to model the work of the divine if we bring our own knowledge and skills in care to others, right? We can all find our own way to be like this woman. So that's my invitation to us. That's some good something goods, right? Thank you, friends. Thank you, friends, for your grace in making meaning of this story with me today. Well done. Let's move into some worship.